Okay, so we'll move on to the last section of the day, and it'll hopefully link back to what many of you have been asking throughout the session, which is the how. How are we going to measure this? How are we going to keep check and keep justified, and make sure that this isn't just all hot air, which we really don't want it to be, and we intend for it not to be, and hope that all of you will hold us to account over this as well. So this section is going to be myself and Sarah, and we're going to be covering quite a bit around the tools and around the next steps and the workshops that'll be happening next week. But first of all is a video, our last video of the day, to give you a bit of insight into the tools, and then we'll go into more detail on that.
Rising from the grassroots of this city, a revolution is happening. Birmingham Food Revolution. By the people, for the people. And we are here to show you what it's all about. This is our Big Bold City tool. The tool helps us to map what actions are taking place across the food system, set priorities and what we need to do first, capture whose voices are being listened to and who we need to reach out to, and identify solutions and who needs to work together to make actions happen. The tool helps do this whilst looking at the food system from different angles, including across the food cycle, across different stages of the life course, across different people and communities, and across different settings in our city. This is our Food Action Decision Making and Prioritisation FADMAP tool. As we push forward with our vision, our actions need to be people-focused, working towards our ambition and addressing key priorities, and effective and realistic. The 12 criteria in this tool help us to develop ideas, compare potential actions, and justify our decisions. It's the tool that holds us to account and makes sure we are on the right track. This is part of our city's vision for a better future. But the journey has already begun.
Nope, don't need to watch that a second time. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into the Big Bold City tool and the FADMAP, which we'll go into more detail in a moment. So I'll let Sarah do that section when we get to it. So them two tools you can find in the Birmingham Food System Strategy. So do go onto the website to read them in more detail. But to refocus us down into the how, so the Birmingham Food System Strategy is an 8-year strategy, and it gives us some of the kind of the headings and the aims and the ambition of what we want to try and achieve. But we need to focus that down a lot more into key actions, key processes, governance and oversights that we will have to ensure that things are going in the right direction and moving and being accounted for. So on the screen, you'll see two quick demonstrations of kind of the governance that are over the Birmingham Food System Strategy within the city. So our intention is for the food system strategy to build into the food system strategic action plan and the action groups that are going to feed into them action plan. So next week, there will be 10 2-hour sessions, workshops with leaders, community members, business owners, national representatives, representatives from the Magdala Consortium and other universities from across the city for each one of the 10 streams. So that's the 4 cross-cutting and the 6 strategic streams. So each of these workshops are going to create actions based off the tools that Sarah's going to go on to in a minute, that are delivered in the short term, medium term, and long term. And that's all going to feed into an action plan that will then be measured and shared on our Birmingham Food Revolution site, and it will be a live document. So as the food system fluxes and we have to adapt and change, we will adapt and change the action plan. But it will be so we can be accountable and show progress over the next 8 years. And this will feed into the Creating a Healthy Food City Forum. So the Creating a Healthy Food City Forum, you may have spotted that Sarah mentioned this earlier, is chaired by Councillor Khan, and is a council forum of leaders and partners from across the city, from different organisations, all in the position of change makers or decision makers. We're going to hold the strategy, the action plan, and the work that happens in the city to account, and keep measuring those processes and updates throughout the 8 years up to 2030 that we'll be running. And all that feeds into the statutory board of the Health and Wellbeing Board. So the Health and Wellbeing Board is the statutory function that has to happen, that has leaders, big high-level strategic leaders, city leaders from across different organisations such as the NHS, policing, business and general health and wellbeing organisations, and many, many more. And they will keep oversight of the Creating a Healthy Food City Forum and the wider strategy, and link the strategy into the wider systems that are going on. And there's also other strategic boards that will be tapped into, including the financial inclusion and others that are happening within the city. And then under that, you'll see kind of a breakdown of how the groups will work. As I said, you've got the 4 cross-cutting themes, but also the 6 work streams, and they'll be feeding into the forum and then into the oversight. So hopefully that gives you the idea of how big of a project it is, but also how we have a vision for what we want to achieve, and we have a process, and we begin this journey next week, Monday to Friday. So if you are interested in joining those groups, or if you have an interest in any of those areas or specialisms, and we haven't reached out to you yet, please let us know. Contact us on the email accounts, which is foodsystemph@birmingham.gov.uk. It'll be at the end of the conference, or via the link, which I believe Neve has put into the chat before, but Neve or Chloe or Rosie or Sarah, if you can put that into the chat. So there's a link to register your interest to be part of one of the groups, and I'll take you through to a Microsoft Forms site. So this is kind of the steps that we're intending to take, and this is what we're going to be covering next week in the 10 sessions. So we'll be going through and reviewing the membership of the groups itself, but also of the Creating a Healthy Food City Forum, and how it all lines up into the right kind of power play that we need to make to be able to drive action in the city. We'll be looking at the current motives, the current initiatives and projects. As Anna mentioned earlier, it's not about the council taking over. It's about empowering the projects that are already there, the change makers that are already there, the community leaders, the Birmingham food legends, to be able to amplify and platform what they're already doing in the city. And then we'll be using the Big Bold City tool to make sure that everybody is accounted for, and that the gaps are identified, and that we're doing the right things in the right places, the right type of pace that needs to happen. And then we'll be moving through into the FADMAP, which is an awesome 12-step tool that's very focused on how we're going to make sure the food system actions we take are measured and are justified and can be delivered over the 8 years. And all that will feed back into the Food System Strategic Action Plan that will be counted by the Creating a Healthy Food City Forum. So it's a long process, an exciting process, but a process that we're going to be able to evidence at every point. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah to talk us through the tools. So there'll be the Big Bold City tool and the FADMAP tool.
Thanks, Bradley. Yeah, I think one of the things we recognised when we started this area of work was how complicated it is to deliver a system approach. There's lots of people who are involved with mapping systems and creating complicated maps that show all the different intricate parts and all the ways they're connected. But what we were really keen to do is to make sure that we could turn that into something that was usable, and something that we could build into processes, and I guess to systematize our approach to the system. So we have consulted with it on this approach quite heavily during the consultation. We've engaged with a lot of people who are experts in this area of system change to find out, well, what is possible. And I think one of the things we found is that nobody's mastered it yet, and we don't claim to have mastered this yet. But what we were able to do is collaborate on coming up with an approach that I think fits quite well for our approach in our city, and also importantly just means that we're not going to have big gaps that we haven't even considered. If there's an area of work that we're not working on, it needs to be for a considered, validated reason, not because we've just forgotten or didn't realise it was there. So that's been the driving force behind what we've been doing. So the Big Bold City tool has been really key to this. We want to consider not only the members of our groups, of when we're coming together to discuss things, and not just when we're consulting with people out in the city, but also looking at just reaching out to new people across the whole city and different projects. And we need to consider all of those things through various lenses. So one of them is across the food cycle. So we need to consider the entire process of our food from start to finish, from when it comes from the farm all the way through to the fork. And we need to look at things like production and processing, distribution, retail, consumption, and waste. And when we're thinking of actions and the people we're talking to, we have to work out, are we talking at the right stage of the food cycle to overcome the challenge we've identified? Because sometimes it's easy to say, oh, we've got to change what people are eating because it's unhealthy, so we need to do an education program. Whereas actually, if you look back in the system, you go, oh, hang on, is it that? Or is it because we need to review what's on the menus, or the catering training, or the supply and making nutritious food more affordable for food businesses? Or is it that we need to actually change the entire supply chain and what's in our city? So when we start looking at it across the food cycle, we start to come up with different solutions and recognizing where the true levers for change are. So it's a way to validate any plans we have, to say, is this the correct part of the food cycle? And are we talking to the right people across the whole food cycle? The next thing we consider is across the city. We have a large city and a huge population and a very varied food system. The experience for somebody in one area of the city is not the same as somebody else. We have areas of our city where there's not a supermarket within a 15-minute walk. These tend to be the most deprived areas, and then you are forced to need to shop from a convenience store, which has less food on offer, and what is healthy and nutritious tends to be more expensive, largely because the supermarkets falsely push prices down, not because the convenience stores are actually making it unrealistically expensive. So it's really complicated. But when we start putting ourselves in the shoes of people from different areas of the city, and you look at the food system from their perspective, you start recognizing that the solutions might not be what you expect. For example, do we need to, rather than building a massive supermarket in an area, is it that we need to make it so deliveries are more affordable? Rather than having to have a £40 threshold to get a home delivery and paying for a delivery slot, do we need to look at how we can link people in so they can still benefit from that bulk purchase approach, but without having to spend quite as much per week as is required on those shopping apps? The other things to consider are things like transport. If you haven't got access to a car, or you can't afford to tax it or have insurance, or like, it's incredibly expensive to have a car. But if you haven't got a car, that completely changes your shopping experience, because you're either going to have to go in a taxi, you're going to have to walk, you're going to have to go on a bus. So then you're looking at solutions. Well, how can you make sure somebody can benefit from the value that you get from buying in bulk, while still being something they can actually get home? And then once you're home, where are you going to put it? If you've got a small place, you haven't got space to store like a giant bag of rice and all these other things. So when you start considering different areas of the city and the true challenges people face, you start thinking about the solutions in a very different way as well. And I think we can explore lots of other things around people and our communities too. So what we've started to develop is a list of the different people and scenarios that we need to make sure we've considered when we're developing our plans. We obviously have to consider all the protected characteristics. This is something that we all have a responsibility to consider in our work. But we can do more. We can go beyond that, and we can look at different life circumstances, challenges that people face that really impact on them and their interaction with the food system. For example, if you've got no recourse to public funds, they're not able to get support. These people literally need help getting any food at all. So we need to consider things from their perspective. What's their experience? If you're homeless, if you've got no fixed address, if you're new to an area and you just don't know the food system and what's available and what support there is, if you've just lost your job and you are living paycheck to paycheck, like what situations and what support systems are there for people in that place? Relationship breakdowns have huge impacts on household income and our abilities to cook. And if you're staying on your mate's sofa for a while, can you even use the kitchen? Is there space in the fridge for you to use it? All those sorts of things will have an effect, and especially when you have that interaction with mental health and well-being, and the effect this has on you as a whole, and food plays one part of that. And obviously there's social isolation and domestic abuse and other life circumstances as well. So we need to make sure we're considering people who are in vulnerable situations that could have a huge impact on their interaction with the food system. There's also health conditions and illnesses, so diabetes, coronary heart disease, allergies, eating disorders, anxiety, depression. All of these have an impact on how we interact with food. So we need to think about the whole person when we're considering actions too. Also, we have different abilities. So whether it's visual or hearing impairments, physical disability, neurodiversity, and processing information in a different way, it's really important to consider that if you develop a one-size-fits-all approach, it is not going to fit everybody. And we need to make sure that we consider these different people and their what would be most helpful for them in their situation. And that's the same goes for financial situations. So if you're depending on your income, if you're out of work, not receiving the real living wage, like you cannot budget your way out of not having enough money for food. Like if you're paying a huge amount of rent and all these other things that affect your cost of living, you can be as savvy as you want. You don't have enough money to live. So that's something that needs to be addressed at a system level. But we also need to consider the impact of that on people's access to food and ability to cook it as well. Also got maternity leave and the really conflicting times you have when you have a child. You are making impossible choices every day about whether you work, whether you buy a particular food. And people say, oh, you shouldn't have formula, you should have breastfeed. What happens if you haven't got enough food in your tummy to be able to continue producing breast milk? Like there's all these situations that need to be considered, and there are no simple solutions in there either. Also, if you're receiving benefits, if you're in debt, we've got to come out with ways that are supporting the whole person again. And also there are people who face inequalities, and there's particular groups that are already suffering inequalities that we need to consider their perspective with food in particular as well. And this is an approach that is central to public health. So I'm really proud that our team is based within the public health team, because it empowers us to be able to put that and tackling injustice at the core of what we're doing. So we're not doing these things just for improving economy or environment and all these different factors. We're actually looking at it from the perspective of how can we tackle injustice, and by doing that we are strengthening our economy. So it's really fundamental to our approach. And then finally, we've got different settings across the city, and each of these places has a very unique role that they can play. There's areas you might not consider that you think, actually, if we did an intervention in that space, then we'd catch this person and give them support the moment they need it most. But it's difficult to think of all those settings like off the top of your head. And sometimes you've got people in a room that are only aware of the settings they regularly work with. But by having a list of settings that you can reflect on and look at, it makes you think quite differently about some of the solutions. For example, prisons and rehabilitation. Prisons have less money per day for food for the entire day per prisoner than a child does for lunch at school. It's like, how is that even possible to feed somebody? And especially when you look at the inequalities in terms of how people ended up in the situations that they ended up in prison, we need to be looking at, again, the whole person, the wider system, and looking at inequalities from lots of different perspectives. But also the power that some of these places have. Faith settings are absolutely core to communities. There's also huge industry networks that support businesses when they're setting up, and if we can influence the food economy from that perspective, that leads to opportunities. There's also innovation and growth with SMEs, whether it's around food logistics or new foods or new food businesses. There's a lot we can do in those areas as well. And also just the huge number of big employers in the city. They are central. We spend so much of our days in a workplace or connected to work. So not only can we look at things like canteens and the food offer, but also good well-being approaches to the workday. Like, could we build in sections of the day where people feel allowed to go off and prep their food that they're going to cook later? Like if you had 15 minutes a day where you said, you go do what you need to do, whether it's going for a walk or you're going to chop some onions ready for your meal later. If we can overcome some of the barriers to busy lifestyles where, like many of us, we need multiple incomes in a household to be able to survive. And that means there's not really enough time to do the food prep in the day because we're trying to juggle everything else in our lives. So if we can come up with holistic ways to tackle these challenges, it will really help too. So that's just some of the things that we're considering in this space. And I think the Big Bold City tool will help us consider that bigger system in a very real way. It's not a theoretical system. This is real people and real places and what we're able to do. But we also need to consider we have lots of actions that we want to prioritise. How on earth do we choose between all these incredibly vital things that need to happen? I realise this is going to move continuously, which is very exciting. So we've broken our decision making down into 3 sections. We need actions to be people focused. So that means they need to put citizens first. This needs to, when we choose to do something, it needs to be benefiting citizens and what they actually need and want and have called out for. We also need to celebrate diversity and incorporate our cultural diversity, but not just that, but all types of diversity in our city into our actions. And we need to make sure we're considering and celebrating that. We need to be empowering people. We don't need to swan in and drop in some project that stamps on every locally innovated, amazing project that there is. We need to be working with communities to empower them to do something they're already on the cusp of doing or supporting something to continue and grow. We also need to work towards our ambition and address key priorities. So this includes addressing poverty and inequalities. We also need our approaches and our actions to be healthy and safe and to be supporting that in our city. It needs to be environmentally sustainable. So this isn't just about carbon, but also soil quality and looking at the impact of the decisions we make on plastics, on the materials that we use, and also where we're sourcing things from and whether things, for example, food systems are complex. If something is grown somewhere where it's seasonal, even if it's far, far away in the world, it's still more environmentally sustainable to ship that over to our country than it is to force it to be grown in our country with a hothouse where you've got the lights and you've got the heating and all that monitoring. Where food is grown in its optimal form in season, that is when it saves the most energy. But it doesn't mean that we should get food from all around the world. It means we need to eat seasonably and look at what's actually thriving in our country at different times of year. And if we do need to ship things from abroad during December and January, for example, and February, where there's limited food available, we need to be considering how to do that in an environmentally sustainable way that looks at the bigger picture. Economic sustainability is really key. Like, businesses literally can't do anything unless it's economically viable. If we ask them to do something and they can't do it, they go bust, or people lose their jobs, and there's all these challenges as well. So we need to look at how we can make sure that everybody's thriving with the decisions that are made. Finally, we need to make sure that whatever we're planning to do is effective and realistic. It needs to be evidence-based. And this is why working in collaboration with so many people across the city helps. There's a lot of research and reviews and recommendation papers from all sorts of different perspectives. And it's not just from academia, it's also from people who've delivered projects before and have learned from the process. So we need to make sure that we're using this evidence to influence our approach and what we're doing, and really checking, like, do we actually know all the evidence for this type of action, and actively seeking out more to shape our approach. We need to be cost effective because it's tough times for everybody, not just with the cost of living, not just with Section 114 and all these other scenarios, but things are expensive, and we need to make sure that we get the most impact for every penny that we spend, because that's just the only way that we can thrive as a city from many, many different perspectives. We need to be risk aware and resilient. We need to predict things that could happen. Like, what happens if there's a pandemic? Who would have thought about that before with their project? But we need to think about things like, what will happen to this project if this person changes jobs? What will happen if this funding goes away? What can we do to make sure that whatever's happening isn't reliant on very few factors, and it's actually embedded and resilient and has come up with mitigations for some of the risks that we have identified? The other thing is we need things to be scaled and paced. Like, if we've got some really great project that's come, how can we learn from that? How can we scale this up? How can we make sure we're addressing some of the biggest needs in our city in a way that addresses the urgent action that's required? So wherever we can, if we can design things so that we can learn and build as we go along, it means that we can scale it up. So if there's a great way to do a project, Feeding Britain, for example, have developed a huge amount of resources to support food projects on the ground. If you're setting up food pantries, and if you want to consider how to do things safely, WRAP have developed resources to support people with making sure that surplus food is handled in a way that supports food hygiene. So where we've got projects like that, we can help projects scale up by overcoming some of these barriers. And finally, learning and improving. We need to make sure that whatever we do, we capture the impact. We capture what's happened, not just what worked well, but what we learned along the way and what challenges there were and what we would do differently next time. And just ensuring that we're sharing that, like sharing what works well and sharing what doesn't work well with everybody. Don't just give this nice simplified version of, oh yeah, it was amazing, and then move on and ignore all the bad side, because otherwise other people are going to do the same errors in their projects. We can just be open with, we're not perfect, we are evolving and building our approaches. And the other thing that I'm really passionate about, and what we're doing with some of the networks that we're setting up, for example, the urban food city network that we're looking at setting up for the UK, is not just looking at what needs to happen in cities, but how. Like, that's often the missing part. Like, we can be as inspired as we want with some big system project, but how do you make that work in a very complex political and legal and financial situation, and all the processes that are involved and complex ones in every single different organization? And I think the more we can capture the how and give people the examples to build on and say, oh, actually, we did an entire grant program that was co-produced in this way, here's how you can do it yourself. We can mobilize action much faster if we're looking at those sorts of learnings as well as just the project outcomes. So this tool, it's still evolving in how we're going to be using it. Both the Big Bold City tool and the FADMAP tool will be core to the decision making we make with the action groups going forwards. So next week we've got 10 action groups for each of the cross-cutting themes and the work streams in the strategy. And this tool will be just used to validate, sense check our ideas and develop plans as we go forward. And if anybody's particularly passionate about this type of work, we've already identified people who are particularly interested in that type of thing. We really welcome ideas of how we could build on this approach, and I'm really excited to see what we develop, because then we could share this with other cities and other organisations too. And I think it will really help with decision making for like anybody in the food system to look at those 12 criteria and think, hang on, is this the best approach we can take, or can we make it even better? So I'm excited that we're able to deliver this strategy in a structured framework that I believe will help us get to the next stage. But obviously it is literally only possible together. And I think today has shown just how much people are truly empowered in our city. This isn't the council leading anything. We are facilitating a lot of connections and we're bringing things together, but people are taking it and running with the idea. It is the most inspirational and rewarding thing I've ever seen, to know that without us even being in the room or talking to people, they are already developing new modules on university courses that are structured around the food system strategy, or they're building the principles into the approaches they're taking in schools. And I'm going to pass over to Bradley now, because everyone knows I can talk forever about this stuff. But yeah, that's the sort of structure we're taking to make sure that we can implement this plan.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So hopefully that answers some of the questions on how, and do, like Sarah highlighted, so Neve has put into the chat the Microsoft forms, so do fill out the form, and we'll be in touch around getting more involved with the working groups and getting your input into those working groups. So there's still time for questions, so feel free to put them into the Q&As or into the chat. But we are at the end of day one. So thank you to everybody who has taken part today and stayed with us throughout the whole session. The day one of this event will be on YouTube in the coming days. And if you haven't registered yet for day two, there's still time. So if you go to Ticket Source, the Birmingham Food Revolution landing page, and you can register for day two, and the webinar link will be going up on there later on this evening as well. And I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers, so Councillor Khan, Justin, Sarah, Anne and Helen, because I can see you on the screen, you're in front of me at the moment, James, Eric, Vicky, Afia, Anna, and I believe and Rosie, of course, for taking part today and for speaking, for sharing your experience and knowledge, and for being an ambassador for the Birmingham Food Revolution and the Food City, for the food system. And also thank you to Leticia for running the session, keeping us on track, sorting out the Zoom platform for us, and just for being amazing as always. So just so everyone's aware, Leticia is going to be tapping in and Sarah's going to be tapping out for the facilitator role tomorrow. So me and Leticia are going to be heading up tomorrow's session and all the amazing stuff that we're going to be covering. And just to give you some insight into tomorrow's session, so we are going to be stepping outside of Birmingham and into the national and international space, and Birmingham's role on the global stage, but also what's going on across the UK and what's going on internationally and how that feeds into what's happening here in Birmingham. So we've got some exceptional speakers, some very famous speakers, some internationally, global change speakers, and many more. I'm not going to say the names because I'm hopefully encourage you to go to the website and go register to become and join the event tomorrow. So again, thank you everyone. I'm going to put a feedback form link into the chat. If you can take the time to complete the form, that will be very useful for us to evaluate the session and what you've taken away from today. We will also be sending out an email as well, because I am trying to put it in and it is not quite working for me. Okay, I will leave that for the emails unless Neva's got the forms link put in ready. But yeah, thank you everyone. You get a couple of, I think 40 minutes back to your day, and hopefully we will see you all at day 2 on the Global Food Revolution session tomorrow. All right, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.